But now I want to take a look more specifically with the methodology, because people seem to have some difficulty to identify the methodology. You correct me if you disagree. When they killed Kennedy, they used an ONE and CIA agent named Oswald, who was in fact an anti-Castrist, but in the media they staged him as a Marxist and a pro-Castro. They used this guy that they betrayed as a patsy to blame the KGB and the pro-Russian movement in the assassination, while Kennedy was trying to make peace with Russia. This methodology with the inversion in the mind of the collective people is something that is very, to me, it looked like Satanism kind of trick, or, when they killed the brother of Kennedy, they used a so-called pro-Palestinian fake killer, and while in fact there was a cop behind Robert Kennedy that shoot behind him, and they blame the pro-Palestinian, and this referred to a program in the CIA of manipulation of the mind, and when you compare to Ukraine, there is a lot to say with this kind of methodology. What do you think about this?
Well, I think you're right. I think the case of Oswald himself is a very interesting one. And I had the advantage of getting to meet Marina Oswald many years later. And she confirmed a lot of these things about how he was, she wasn't political at the time, but afterwards she became political. She drank 4 pots of coffee a day. She had stacks of books and articles and his letters all over the house. And what she said is that she found out that he was not what they said he was, that he was supposedly a communist who was recruited to communism when he went to Russia, or even before that. He had studied Russian in the military, and there's this whole story, a whole cover story of Oswald as a pro-communist, and we mentioned the Castro connection. The Fair Play for Cuba, which was pro-Castro, and the anti-Cuban operation in New Orleans was run out of the same building. Yeah. And Guy Bannister, a high-level FBI operative, was running both sides.
He was from Chicago at the beginning. He was from the FBI of Chicago. He was so-called a former agent of the FBI. He was still involved in it.
Yeah, of course he was. And he had people around him like David Ferrie, who's very significant in the Kennedy assassination. Bannister was tied to the networks of Clay Shaw and Permindex. So what you had was, you create a kind of a miasma, a fog, that is hard to pierce for the average person. It gets too complicated. Was Oswald pro-Castro or anti-Castro? Why did he go to Mexico, the Russian embassy in Mexico City, when it turns out that probably wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald who went? It was part of the cover story that was being created. You create then phony conspiracy theories that are designed to throw people off the trail by becoming more and more bizarre, when the reality is fairly straightforward. Kennedy was prepared to go against the British Empire, and including its deep penetration of the U.S. intelligence community. And this is where, if you look at the networks behind Oswald and behind the assassination, what you find is this character, Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who was in the Special Operation Executive of the British Empire in World War II, the secret operation of the British, but also worked with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. Bloomfield worked very closely with a man named Sir William Stevenson, who is famous because of the code breaking of the Nazis during World War II. He was codenamed a man called Intrepid. There's a book about him. Yeah.
By the way, Clay Shaw and Bloomfield were coming from the Churchill circle, both of them.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to just go through this importance of where Bloomfield came from, because Sir William Stevenson was the one who went in during World War II and reorganized U.S. intelligence, largely through the Office of Naval Intelligence. which is a long-standing British connection in the United States, going back to the works of Alfred Thayer Mahon, who wrote the famous book, The Influence of Sea Power in History, which claims that God made Britain the greatest power in the world because of their location and the fact they didn't have that many raw materials, so they had to become a sea power. Mahon was trying to influence U.S. policy. At the same time, Mackinder was developing the geopolitical theory in the early 1900s. So Stevenson comes out of that grouping. How do you keep the United States as a dumb muscle on a British leash? And so Stevenson organized networks in the OSS, and he was at odds with William Donovan, who was actually Roosevelt's choice to run the OSS and then the CIA, but Donovan didn't continue. But the Stevenson networks did. And the two key people in that were Allen Dulles and then later James Jesus Angleton. They were the ones who were in Europe during World War II in Switzerland, Dulles was, organizing the Rat Line, the escape of the Nazis at the end of World War II. And these were the networks that were used to build up assassination teams inside NATO countries, especially to target the Greek situation, the Italian situation, even in France, where they feared that the communists, who were briefly in power, I believe, in 1947 in a popular front, they were targeted by what was called the Lovestone networks. Lovestone was another CIA operative who was deployed into the Union movement. So this is what you're talking about methodology. This is it. You get people who proclaim to be patriots of a country or supporters of a country who are actually supporting something which goes against the interests of that country, but goes in favor of control by a supranational or globalist. Today we call them globalists, but then they were called supranational or anti-sovereigntists. That's the networks that were used to get Kennedy. Now, Bloomfield had a special role because he was the attorney for the Bronfman interests. The Bronfman family was one of the big bootleggers during the Prohibition period. They became very wealthy, operating out of Canada, out of Buffalo, New York. And most of American organized crime, the famous Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, the Purple Gang in Detroit, all of them were part of this British operation because they were getting their booze. Some of it was made in the backyard, but a lot of it was coming from Britain. That's where Joe Kennedy got his booze. And the Bronfmans set up a national organized crime network, which included sports gambling, it included sports services all over the country. Now, this is important because the CIA used these networks. Lucky Luciano was sent to Sicily before the U.S. troops invaded to clear the way with the Sicilian mafia. Lansky and others were involved in money laundering, which was shared, as with this guy Tybar Rosenbaum and others, shared with building up the Mossad, building up the Israeli economy as an ally of this British force. So Bloomfield's role was to create within American intelligence a grouping that was completely sympathetic and literally controlled by British ideology. That's what he did. Now, part of that then, in 1958, they created a company called Permindex, Permanent Industrial Exposition. And it was connected to the World Trade Center in Rome, Bern, Switzerland, Montreal, and then eventually in New Orleans. Clay Shaw, who, as you correctly pointed out, knew Bloomfield for years, they were at the OSS together. He was Colonel Clay Shaw, was his title, was the head of this in New Orleans. And this was identified by the French, I think it was in the mid-60s, maybe it was as late as 67, but the Permindex was the source of a minimum of $200,000 that went to one assassination attempt against de Gaulle that they tracked. And French intelligence concluded that many of the attempts to kill de Gaulle were funded through this same network. And that came to some extent out of Rome. This guy, William Harvey, who was an FBI, CIA operative in Rome, who was controlling assassination squads. But it was also Angleton. It was Dulles. And this is what Bloomfield worked on when he created this network out of New Orleans. And one of the people involved in it was the former Hungarian Prime Minister Nagy. And there's a letter from him asking the CIA if they would be interested in using the services of Permindex at some point in the future. So all of this was what the district attorney in New Orleans, Jim Garrison, investigated when he brought a case against Clay Shaw before, I think in 1967, before the courts, saying that Shaw and Permindex were involved in the Kennedy assassination.
But just I don't want to make any mistake, but I believe that the assassination attempt against de Gaulle was in 62.
Yeah, it was in 62. But I'm saying that the French intelligence did their study and came out with a report in either 65 or 67, identifying this network. That's what I meant. And
with Bloomfield, we have the Canadian networks that not only were involved in the assassination of JFK, but also Martin Luther King and his brother, in fact, with some assassin exfiltration and weapon, in fact.
Yes, exactly. And also, as we talked about last time, Enrico Mattei, the head of Eni, the Italian oil company, whose plane was sabotaged, I think in 62 he died, at a point when he was serving as a back channel to work with the Russians. So again, it's the same targeting. And just to make the point, again, that you were bringing up earlier, this is the same issue behind Ukraine. You know, the Yanukovych, you know, he was a flawed figure. He was not a great leader, but he was not only pro-Putin. He was talking to the EU. He wanted a balance for Ukraine. And the idea that Yanukovych was a Putin puppet and Paul Manafort, who was later was the Trump campaign manager and is now rotting away in prison unjustly, that Manafort was there to help steer Yanukovych to Moscow is a lot of bunk. Ukraine had been destroyed by the International Monetary Fund. And Yanukovych was trying to do something about it, but there was a lot of misery there, and people demonstrated. And in the midst of that demonstration, the National Endowment for Democracy, Soros, the State Department, the US State Department, deployed neo-Nazis with guns to shoot up the Maidan Square in Kiev and blame it on the Yanukovych government.